Years ago, during an important meeting, something seemingly small happened, but it completely changed the dynamics of the room. There were no shouts, no dramatic arguments. It was something much more subtle, and precisely for that reason, much more dangerous. A man sitting on the other side of the table heard a critique of the project he had presented. It wasn't an aggressive critique, just a slightly sarcastic observation. But in a few seconds, something changed. He leaned forward, took a deep breath, and began to explain. He explained the reasoning. He explained the data. He explained the strategy behind the decision. The more he spoke, the more he tried to regain control of the situation. But there was an invisible detail happening at that moment. Each sentence revealed something he hadn't noticed, a small sign of weakness. The curious thing is that he wasn't wrong. His numbers were correct, his analysis made sense, and his logic was sound. But there's a secret about social power that few people truly understand. In competitive environments, meetings, negotiations, debates, people don't just analyze arguments. They observe psychological signals, micro-behaviors, changes in tone of voice, the discomfort when someone is questioned. And at that specific moment, something hidden began to happen in the room. People stopped evaluating only the content and began to feel the energy of the situation. When someone needs to over-explain, over-justify, over-prove, the human brain interprets this as a possible power leak. Now imagine this scene as if it were armor. While someone remains calm, secure, comfortable even in silence, this armor seems solid, but a small emotional reaction is enough for a crack to appear, and when that crack appears, something curious happens. People begin, almost instinctively, to test that structure. Small comments, provocative questions, an observation here, another there. It's not necessarily malice. It's almost a social instinct for manipulation and reading the environment, as if everyone were trying to understand the extent of their true control. And when you start observing this carefully, you notice something even more unsettling about how people detect weakness. There's an old idea, often associated with strategic thinkers like Niccolo Machiavelli, that often makes many people uncomfortable. He observed something that remains true centuries later. In the social world, weakness is rarely hidden. It appears, sometimes in words, but almost always in behavior. Small signs slip out all the time. The need to respond too quickly, the impulse to justify decisions that no one really questioned, or that almost automatic urge to seek approval. These moments seem innocent, but they carry a powerful psychological charge. They are small cracks where other people can perceive your weakness, even if you don't realize it. Think of it like a ship on the ocean. From a distance, it seems strong, solid, impossible to sink. But imagine a small hidden leak in the hull. It's not dramatic at first. A few drops of water slowly seeping in. Nothing that causes immediate panic. But anyone who understands navigation knows the danger isn't in the leak itself. It's in the fact that it reveals a vulnerable point. Something similar happens in human relationships. When someone loses control, reacts emotionally, or tries to defend themselves too much, it acts as a silent signal. A major conflict isn't necessary. A brief moment of exposure is enough to shift the power dynamic. And here's where something even more dangerous comes in. Many people believe that others are always judging their ideas or arguments. But in practice, much of social interaction operates on another level, an almost invisible level of psychological reading. People test limits, observe reactions, analyze who remains silent under pressure and who constantly needs to prove their worth. It's a subtle game of strategy and perception, and the curious thing is that these tests often begin very small. An ironic joke, a mild criticism, a seemingly innocent question. Small movements that actually act as probes trying to find exactly where your weakness lies. And when you start to realize this, an inevitable question arises. Why do people perform these tests almost automatically? There's something curious about human interactions that few people notice. Most weaknesses don't appear in big, dramatic moments. They emerge in almost invisible micro-behaviors. small gestures that slip through before the person even realizes it. Someone asks a challenging question, and in less than 2 seconds, you're already answering. Someone questions your decision, and you immediately try to explain every detail of your strategy. At first glance, it seems like just politeness or good communication, but there's a psychological secret to it. Haste in responding often reveals a need for approval. And this need, when perceived, begins to alter the power dynamic of the conversation. A mentor who observed negotiations used to say something interesting. He said that corporate meetings are like a laboratory for reading people. Those who pay attention can quickly identify who has emotional control and who is trying to protect some weakness. Observe someone who tries to please everyone. They laugh at every joke, agree with every opinion, and avoid any moment of silence in the conversation. They seem friendly, but for attentive observers, this functions as a hidden signal. When someone constantly needs to maintain harmony, others begin to perceive a sensitive point, something that can be exploited with small doses of social manipulation. A simple example happens all the time in work environments. Imagine someone making a mild criticism of your project during a meeting. If the immediate reaction is to explain every detail, show more data, defend every argument, something interesting happens in people's perception. They begin to feel that something dangerous is being protected there. Not because the person is wrong, but because the intensity of the defense reveals that there is an emotional area involved. In contrast, someone who responds calmly, pauses, perhaps even uses a few seconds of silence, conveys something very different: stability. And when this stability appears, something curious happens in the people around. They begin almost instinctively to conduct small tests. After someone notices, even unconsciously, small signs of weakness, something interesting begins to happen in human interactions. People start testing you, not necessarily maliciously, nor always consciously. It's almost a psychological reflex. A small ironic comment here, a provocative question there, a light criticism in the middle of a seemingly normal conversation. These tests function as social sensors. They observe one simple thing: your reaction. If you maintain control, the dynamic remains balanced. But if you react with haste, defensiveness, or discomfort, that small test reveals more information than 1,000 words. An old mentor in negotiation used to say that social environments function like an emotional pressure test. Think of an engineer evaluating a material. He gradually increases the pressure until he finds the point where the structure begins to give way. In human relationships, something similar happens. A person might make a sarcastic comment during a meeting. A colleague might question your point of view in a seemingly casual tone. Even friends do this in informal conversations. It's not necessarily conscious manipulation. Often it's simply instinctive curiosity to understand who truly holds power and who is merely trying to project confidence. A classic example occurs in leadership environments. A leader presents a strategic decision, and someone in the group asks in an almost innocent tone, "Are you sure this is the best approach?" The question seems simple, but it actually functions as a hidden test. If the leader loses control, starts over-explaining, or shows irritation, the entire room notices that small psychological crack. But when the answer comes calmly, perhaps accompanied by a few seconds of silence, something different happens. The atmosphere changes. The person who conducted the test begins to recalibrate their perception. Because now there's a doubt in the air. Perhaps there's no weakness there to exploit. And it's precisely at this point that many people make a critical mistake. There's a specific moment in any human interaction when weakness ceases to be merely a possibility and becomes visible to everyone. Interestingly, this moment almost always arises when someone reacts emotionally. It doesn't have to be an explosion of anger or a dramatic argument. Sometimes a small sign is enough. A change in tone of voice, the haste to interrupt someone, the need to over-explain to regain control of the situation. For those who observe with psychological awareness, these details function as a kind of social radar. They reveal where the person feels threatened, and this, for those who understand power dynamics, is extremely valuable information. An experienced executive once described a curious situation in a strategic meeting. During the presentation of a project, a colleague made a seemingly simple criticism. Interesting. But did you consider the risk of this approach? Nothing aggressive, just a question. But at that moment something changed. The presenter began to speak too quickly, brought up new arguments, opened graphs, tried to reinforce the original strategy. The more he spoke, the more he tried to prove he was right. The problem is that at that moment the discussion was no longer about the project. The entire room was observing something else, the psychological reaction. Without realizing it, he had shown exactly where his weakness lay. Imagine this as armor. While everything is calm, the armor seems perfect, impenetrable. But when someone reacts emotionally, it's as if a small crack appears on the surface. This crack may be almost invisible, but for strategically attentive people it functions as a hidden map. A map that shows where to apply pressure, where to provoke, where to use small doses of social manipulation. That's why some seemingly innocent comments can become so dangerous. They don't attack directly. They only lightly pressure the structure until they reveal where the control begins to fail. And when someone understands this mechanism, a much more important question arises: how to prevent these cracks from appearing? When someone finally realizes how weaknesses manifest in human interactions, an inevitable question arises: how to prevent these emotional cracks from becoming visible? The answer isn't in appearing stronger, but in developing inner control. And here lies a psychological secret that many ignore. Real power is rarely noisy. Most of the time it appears in the form of silence, pauses, and emotional stability. Strategically mature people understand that not every provocation deserves an immediate response. Sometimes the best strategy is simply to observe, breathe, wait a few seconds before speaking. This small space between stimulus and response may seem insignificant, but it completely changes the power dynamic of a conversation. An old negotiation professor used to teach his students a simple exercise. Whenever someone makes a criticism or provocation, don't respond immediately. Mentally count to 3. It seems small, almost banal. But this small moment of silence produces a very interesting psychological effect. First, it prevents you from reacting impulsively and revealing some emotional weakness. Secondly, it creates a slight discomfort in the other person, because the social expectation is usually for a quick response. And in that brief pause, something curious happens. Control of the interaction begins to return to you. It's as if the rhythm of the conversation starts to follow your energy, not the other person's provocation. Another powerful practice is to replace defense with strategic curiosity. When someone questions your decision, instead of going into defensive mode, ask questions. Something like, what specifically worries you about this approach? Or, what scenario do you believe could be dangerous here? This simple change completely alters the psychological game. Instead of appearing as someone trying to protect a weakness, you position yourself as someone who is calmly and strategically analyzing the situation. And curiously, when this posture appears, many manipulation attempts lose strength, because people who seek vulnerabilities quickly perceive when there are no easy emotional reactions to exploit. But there is an even deeper step in this process. After observing human dynamics for some time, many people arrive at a curious conclusion. Their own emotional reactions function as a hidden map of the mind. Each moment of irritation, discomfort, or need for defense reveals something important about where their weakness lies. And here lies a psychological secret that few explore. What bothers you most in others usually points directly to something within you that is not yet under total control. Therefore, strategically intelligent people do not ignore their emotional reactions. They study these reactions as a scientist would study a phenomenon, because there lies valuable information about their own power structure. A leadership mentor used to suggest a simple but extremely revealing exercise. After a meeting, conversation, or discussion, he recommended silently asking oneself 3 questions. At what point did I feel irritation? What specific comment made me want to defend myself? And why did that trigger this reaction? These questions seem simple, but they function as an extremely powerful psychological lens. If criticism of your work provokes a strong reaction, perhaps there is professional insecurity there. If a joke about your social standing bothers you, perhaps there's a sensitive area related to recognition or status. Every emotional reaction reveals a small zone of weakness that can be strengthened with awareness and strategy. Over time, something interesting begins to happen. Instead of reacting automatically, the person begins to observe their emotions with a certain strategic distance. When someone makes a provocative comment, the mind already recognizes the pattern. This is trying to test my control. This level of awareness completely changes the power dynamic in interactions, because a person who understands their own vulnerabilities becomes much harder to manipulate. Small attempts at social manipulation cease to be dangerous, as they no longer find the same emotional ground to operate on. And when this inner clarity begins to solidify, a classic teaching about human power begins to make even more sense. There's an old observation about human strategy that has spanned centuries and remains surprisingly relevant. Thinkers like Niccolò Machiavelli perceived something that many people prefer to ignore. Your adversaries rarely need to be stronger than you. They just need to understand where your weakness lies. This is one of the most dangerous secrets of power dynamics. In many social situations, the battle isn't won by direct force, but by psychologically reading the other person. Whoever identifies the right vulnerabilities can press precisely on the points that provoke reaction, discomfort, or loss of control. Think of it as a hidden map. Each person carries within themselves a set of sensitive points: insecurities, needs for approval, fear of appearing incompetent, fear of losing status. When someone discovers these points, the dynamic changes. Small provocations begin to function as levers of manipulation. A specific comment here, a strategic doubt there, and suddenly the other person begins to react emotionally. The more they try to defend themselves, the more new information they reveal. It's a curious psychological cycle. Each attempt to regain control ends up giving away more clues about their own emotional structure. But here's the real strategy that few understand. When someone consciously works to eliminate or strengthen their emotional weaknesses, this map begins to disappear. Provocations lose their effect. Criticism ceases to be dangerous. Attempts at manipulation simply don't find a strong enough reaction to work. And at that moment, something interesting happens in human interactions. People begin to feel that there is a different kind of power there. Not the noisy power of confrontation, but the silent power of someone who doesn't easily reveal where their vulnerabilities lie. And that's exactly what differentiates people who master their emotions from those who continue to be guided by them. There's a simple idea that separates ordinary people from truly strategic ones. Most believe that power means speaking louder, reacting quickly, proving you're right. But by carefully observing the psychological dynamics of human interactions, something different becomes apparent. The strongest people are rarely the loudest. In fact, they are often the most difficult to read. They maintain control even when provoked. They don't reveal anxiety when criticized. And, most importantly, they don't let slip clear signs of weakness. That's why true power often appears in the form of silence, stability, and emotional awareness. Think about it for a moment. How many times has someone tried to provoke you just to observe your reaction? How many times has a seemingly small comment triggered irritation, defensiveness, or discomfort? These moments seem insignificant, but they reveal something profound about how social strategy works. Each emotional reaction offers a hidden clue to the observer, and when someone understands this mechanism, small provocations can transform into extremely dangerous manipulation tools. But when you begin to recognize your own reactions and strengthen your control, something changes. What once seemed like a threat begins to become just information. Now the important question is, are you willing to observe your own reactions honestly? In what situations do you lose control most easily? What kind of criticism reveals a possible weakness that still needs to be strengthened? Reflect on this. Because people who master this level of psychological awareness begin to develop a rare kind of power, a power that doesn't depend on confrontation, but on inner clarity. If this video made you realize something new about your own reactions, write "control" in the comments. I want to know who is truly willing to develop this level of strategic awareness. And if you want to learn more about silence, strategy, psychological power, and how to avoid manipulation traps, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because in the next videos, we will explore ideas that can completely change the way you understand human relationships.